Good day, Liberators, and welcome back to Survival in the Killing Fields. Before I continue, if you like what I do, please consider supporting me by signing up on Patreon. Or if you prefer an alternative platform, head over to Subscribestar. Your help is greatly appreciated. Chapter 2: Education. With the country at peace, my father began to make more money from his trucking business and from the dry goods store. In 1964, he bought a lumber mill located between Samrong and Phnom Penh, just off National Route 2. By Cambodian standards, the mill was technologically advanced. That is, the saw was driven by a motor rather than pulled by hand. But the motor, which had been taken out of a Jeep, still had a manual crank starter. The first time I tried to start the engine, the crank went around for a couple of rotations until it built up compression. Then it kicked back suddenly in the other direction, nearly breaking my wrist. In a rage, I pulled the crank off and threw it at the engine as hard as I could. Water spurted from the radiator. My mother's dog, a miniature poodle, barked and yipped behind me. I turned around and kicked the dog, which sailed off in the air. My father saw the whole thing. He didn't say a word. He just turned his back on me and sighed, shaking his head as he sadly walked away. I had been a monk, but I had not yet learned the monk's self-control. The mill was a success from the time my father took it over. Soon he had added trucks to haul the logs to his mill. He hired men to cut trees for him in distant forests. He bought a place to live near the mill so he could spend most of his time working. Papa knew exactly what he wanted, which was to become a rich merchant, to have his sons working for him, and to have grandsons sitting on his knees when he grew old. He gave generously to charities like the temples and the Chinese Protective Association because it was expected of him, but his view of the world was fixed and narrow. One of the things my father could not do was read and write Khmer, the native language of Cambodia, though he spoke it fluently. My older brother Feng Huor could read and write Khmer but not well. Neither of them knew French. Most of the government documents were in both Khmer and French. On weekends I bicycled the 5 miles from Phnom Penh to the mill to help with the paperwork. It was my duty to work for the family, but I never felt comfortable doing it. Early on I found that Feng Huor was tampering with the mill accounts and putting money in his own pockets. He also signed off the mill's assets over to his own name without telling my father. There was no easy way for me to solve this problem, not when I was already known as the family troublemaker. On the other hand, my father was the head of the family, the ruler. My brother shouldn't have cheated him. On the other hand, I also had to defer to my brother because he was older than me. He worked hard at the mill and was nearly as essential to its success as my father. 2 French words, honneur and bonheur, express what is important to families like mine. Though my brother was violating the honneur or honor, at least he was doing it quietly. For me to have pointed it out would result in the family losing its bonheur, its happiness or good-hearted feeling. Cambodians will do almost anything to keep the appearances of bonheur. We try to stay polite even when we do not feel like being polite, because it is easier that way. To be in conflict forces us to treat one another as enemies, and then we lose control. In the year 1968, the mill was prospering, but my standing with the family was particularly low. I had failed an exam which, if I had passed, would have enabled me to go on to university. My father wanted me to leave school and work for him full-time as a clerk, but my mother had persuaded him to allow me to continue my studies. So I was retaking the year's courses that led up to the exam. When I parked my bicycle outside the mill on a Saturday morning and walked in, he turned his back on me and watched out of the corner of his eye as I walked to my brother's office. "How's the business going, brother?" I asked, dumping my satchel of schoolbooks in the corner. "We make a little money, in spite of the government," Feng Huor said gloomily. "But the bastards are getting greedier. Here, look at these papers and tell me what they mean." I picked up the sheaf of papers on his desk. They were written both in the Roman letters of French and in the ornate, looping letters of the Cambodian alphabet, with no spaces between the words. I scanned them quickly. "You have solved the problem of the government foresters, I notice." On the form listing the number of logs that my father's trucks carried was a figure far lower than the actual one. "Bonjour, mon ami," my brother said sarcastically, quoting one of the few French phrases he knew. Literally, it was a greeting like hello, but the French practice of shaking hands offered a chance to pass folded money from one palm to another. In Cambodian slang, bonjour means graft. My brother said, "The forester does not have his Mercedes yet, but every time I see him he wears more gold." I read through the receipts and the taxation forms. How boring, what a waste of time. After I filled in the forms, they would lie unread, tied in bundles with a string, in offices whose clerks moved in slow motion under slowly rotating ceiling fans. Government regulations had little effect on businesses like ours. The officials did not make their living from their salaries. They made it from bribes. It was an age-old system. Those in power took from those who weren't. As long as the officials did not take too much, there was no protest. But it made me angry just the same. For most of the week, I lived in a world of idealistic students. We were young and believed in progress and honesty and change. We were also Buddhist, and the tradition of bonjour conflicted with an even deeper and older tradition of moral behavior. I said, if the government lowered its taxes, it would be easier to pay the full amount. Then nobody would have to cheat. "You think so?" said my brother. "The government loves to tax and tax. That's the problem. Look," he said, pointing at a map of Cambodia. "There is a new military checkpoint here and another one here. Bonjour and bonjour. Worse, the soldiers just bought motorcycles. This week they started going after the logging trucks with their motorcycles, after the driver already stopped at the checkpoints. The soldiers wanted more money." Impatiently, he returned to the table and flicked his fingers across his abacus. The wooden beads made a rapid clacking sound. "Maybe we shouldn't give it to them," I said, reading through the forms. "What do you mean?" "Well, the logging truck is new and powerful. Tell the driver to pay at the checkpoints but to head the soldiers off when they come after him on motorcycles. If the motorcycles try to pass him on the left, he veers to the left. If they try to pass him on the right, he veers to the right. They'll never stop him." "I think that's a terrible idea," said my brother gloomily. "Come, fill out these papers so we can finish here and go back to Samrangyong." At the end of work on Saturdays, we always returned to our native village, which was still our family's home. I went back to work with a sigh. A week passed. The next Saturday morning I rode my bicycle into the mill yard again. The logging truck was there, dust coating the cab and a load of logs stacked on the back. So were several unmarked automobiles belonging to the judicial police. The policemen had gotten out of the cars with pistols in their holsters. They had knocked at the office door. My father was just opening the door. One of the policemen said loudly that the logging truck hadn't stopped on the road when the soldiers tried to pull it over. He paused for effect before telling my father the reason. "Your driver was afraid to stop because he was carrying communist literature. You have been distributing pamphlets for the North Vietnamese." In 1954, after a fierce war, France withdrew from its former colony Vietnam, which split into two countries, a communist North Vietnam with its capital at Hanoi, and a non-communist South Vietnam with its capital at Saigon. In the early 1960s, the North Vietnamese began trying to take over the South militarily. The Americans sent in troops to protect South Vietnam, and later more and more troops, and by 1968 war was again at its height. Officially, Cambodia was neutral, but neutrality was difficult to keep because the war was next door and many Cambodian officials were dishonest. The police were very clever. Instead of being defensive about collecting illegal bribes, they accused my family of committing crimes against the state. The charge was so hard to disprove even though it wasn't true. My father's logging sites were near the Cambodia-South Vietnam border. The North Vietnamese communists had supply routes through the area, and communist sympathizers occasionally distributed their literature to the common people. I even knew a communist myself. The judicial police had arrested my ex-teacher Che Won for subversive activities. I had visited him in jail, but until then I hadn't known he was a communist. I didn't have any communist sympathies, and neither did my father or brother. They were businessmen. All they cared about was making money. The police interrogated my father in Phang War. My father saw me standing around, watching and listening. He told me to go away. I answered that I wanted to stay around and watch in case the police planted communist pamphlets and pretended to find them. A policeman overheard me. "So you think we are trying to trick you, eh?" he said. He took me outside and threw me into one of the police cars. They put my brother in another car and the truck driver in a third, so we couldn't talk to each other and agree on a story. By then they were going through the mill and through my father's house, scattering equipment and upending furniture. The police drove the three of us to their headquarters in Phnom Penh. They put us in separate cells. Then they began to beat me and tried to get me to confess. I should explain that Cambodian society has a minor tradition of torture. In the early 1950s, when my father was kidnapped, the government soldiers tied him to a ladder, feet up and head down, and poured anchovy sauce into his nostrils. It was extremely unpleasant for my father, but he didn't suffer any permanent harm. In Phnom Penh in the late 1960s, the police put my hand in a vice and kept tightening it as they questioned me, but they didn't actually try to crush my hand. When the vice didn't work, because I wouldn't admit to anything, they put me in a rice sack and hit me with sticks, but not very hard. As usual, the real reason for the torture was to raise the asking price for my release. On the third evening, my parents bought my way out. The truck driver had already confessed to distributing communist leaflets. To get my older brother out, they had retained a prominent lawyer friend of Chinook's. Day after day, my father went to the lawyer to pressure for my brother's release. Eventually, the lawyer, whose name was Pen Nuth, managed to get an audience with Sihanouk, and Sihanouk, who had no part in the scheme, issued a proclamation that my family was innocent. In this way, my brother obtained his freedom. My father was discouraged. He had paid Pen Nuth 1.2 million reals, which was then worth about $85,700 US. Presumably, Pen Nuth had kept some of the money for himself and spread the rest around to various officials, including the secret police and Sihanouk's hangers-on. Sihanouk himself was not especially corrupt, but he did very little to stop the corruption and seldom punished those who were caught. So we could not expect justice from the government. But at least the family was together again. After my brother and I were released, Papa wanted more than ever to have us living and working together as a unit. He told me gruffly that I ought to get married and come home. It would be better, he said, if I worked full-time for the family business. I answered carefully. Papa, I said, I don't have much expertise in business. Perhaps it would be better if I had more schooling first. I didn't tell him my real thoughts. I hated business. I didn't like taking orders from bosses or giving orders to employees. Above all, I didn't want to have to bribe government officials all my life. If you gave them enough, they just wanted more. If you didn't give them enough, they put you in jail and beat you. The eyebrows arched on my father's plump face. You want to stay in school? He asked incredulously. He didn't say what he thought either, but I knew. Papa knew the longer students stay in school, the greater fools they become. And in a way he was right. I'd suggested that the truck drivers speed past soldiers to avoid paying a few reals, and look what it had cost us. I told my father that I'd like to study medicine at the university. What? 7 more years before you can make any money? He turned away, unwilling to look in my direction. You expect me to pay for you to study while the rest of us are working? He sent me off and we didn't discuss it anymore. I felt terrible. Somehow things were always going wrong and I was always getting the blame. And yet, of all 8 children in the family, except perhaps for my sister Che Thao, who was very religious, I was the one with the best intentions. Of 5 sons, I was the one who cared most about living honestly, not cheating anybody, and not being cheated in return. I had never stolen anything up to that point, unlike Feng Huo. My mother talked to my father and got him to bend his views against his instinct. Over the next few years, my father gave Feng Huo money to give to me for school. It was never as much as I needed. Even so, Feng Huo, my rival, gave it to me reluctantly, like a rich man giving a gift to a peasant who does not really deserve it. So I continued to live in Phnom Penh, where I had gone to lycée. It was a city of wide boulevards, overlooking the juncture of the Mekong River and the Tonle Sap River, which came together like the letter X and separating again on their slow, lazy course towards South Vietnam and the South China Sea. Footnote: below Phnom Penh, the continuation of the Tonle Sap River is known as the Basak. During the dry season, the rivers shrunk to narrow channels at the bottom of their banks, until at the peak of the floods, the water from the Mekong reversed course and actually flowed up the Tonle Sap River. filling the basin of the nation's great freshwater lake Tonle Sap. I lived in a temple compound under a monk's quarters built on stilts. There was something rootless about the arrangement, but it cost me little and I liked it. Everything about it struck me as natural and appropriate. From the discipline of sweeping the courtyards, to the sight of the monks' robes hanging on clotheslines in a dozen different shades of yellow and orange, with its multicolored tile roofs and the curving golden ornaments protruding from the peaks like storks' necks. Most of all, I loved the freedom, because the monks let me alone. Indirectly, with only an occasional word of advice, they helped me learn calmness. With my temper under better control, it was easier to study. I passed my exam the second time around and entered the medical program at the National University. The first year was pre-medical, with courses in biology, physics, chemistry, and other basic sciences. The next year was the beginning of medical school itself. 6 years of clinical work, literatures, and labs. All the classes were in French. The curriculum followed the French model with one important difference. Because of the shortage of doctors in Cambodia, we medical students were allowed to practice before we got our degrees. So within a few years I would be able to get a part-time medical job to support myself. The only problem was getting enough money in the meantime. I decided to teach. By then I had a thorough grasp of the subjects on the various exams. I became a remedial science teacher at several lycées, squeezing the class time into my busy schedule, racing through the quiet avenues on my bicycle. I also became a tutor at private homes. A friend of mine from lycée, a girl named Kam Sunuri, had 2 younger sisters who were having trouble with their studies. She arranged for me to teach them. I arrived at the Kam residence across an alley from a large temple called Wat Lanka and parked my bicycle. It was early evening. The house was set back from the street, behind a fenced enclosure holding several small dogs. Over the decades, the house had settled unevenly on its foundations. The red tile roof had become weathered and discolored. No bonjour here. Mr. Kam, a low-paid veterinarian in the government service, came to the door. I greeted him respectfully and he showed me a small room down a side corridor. There was a blackboard on one wall. The 2 younger Kam girls were sitting at a table. At another table was another girl, a cousin who had come to Phnom Penh from her home in Kampot province. I stepped to the blackboard and, without any of the usual courtesies, began asking the girls why they were having trouble with their exams. I paced back and forth, trying to discover how much or little they knew, asking one question after another. I had to be impartial and correct with them. The door to the hallway was open, and everything we said could be heard throughout the house. But I also didn't want to be excessively polite, as Cambodians often are, hiding excuses behind the mask of politeness, allowing failure for the sake of keeping face. The girls didn't know much about the sciences. The Kam sisters in particular hadn't grasped the concept of chemical valences. So I stepped to the blackboard, drew a table of the elements, and began explaining how chemicals combine. 3 evenings a week it went like this, reviewing basic concepts, steadily making progress. I began looking forward to these sessions more than to my other classes. There was always a glass of tea waiting when I arrived, placed there by the cousin from Kampot. Her name was Chung Mai Wei. Chung, her family name, Mai meaning beautiful, and Hui meaning flower in Teochew, the Chinese dialect most widely spoken in Cambodia, the same dialect spoken by my family. Once I started teaching those girls, I couldn't change my behavior. I was strict with them. They were polite to me. They called me Luc, a form of address with a meaning like sir, or the French monsieur. All the same, while lecturing them, I sometimes felt self-conscious, like a man who accidentally sees his reflection in a mirror as he's walking down the street. Not much to look at, I thought. Acne scars on my face, glasses, sneakers, unfashionable haircut. I looked like what I was, an unpolished bachelor who lived in a temple. So, if you put carbon, hydrogen and oxygen together to make sugar, how will they combine? I heard myself saying. I called on the girls for the answer. One of the Kam girls looked in her notes in confusion. The other had the wrong answer. Chung Mai Wei raised her eyes directly to me and said in her quiet voice, "It would be C12H12O11, look teacher, for sugars like glucose and sucrose." "Correct," I said. though those three elements also combine with others to form an entire class of organic compounds, the carbohydrates. Most edible plants like cabbages and yams are composed of carbohydrates, along with proteins and minerals. If you burn these vegetables, the same thing happens as when you burn sugar. You drive off the oxygen and hydrogen, and what is left is carbon. I found myself babbling on like that without quite knowing why. Who cared about chemistry? I didn't. They didn't care either. I wish there was a way to take better advantage of being in a room with three attractive young women. I had learned something about women in Phnom Penh, though probably not enough. Of these three in the class, my Wei was the most conscientious. She was also the most shy. She never said an extra word, but she phrased what she said precisely, while her two cousins whispered and giggled. She wore Chinese-style pajamas, ordinary house clothes. Her pajamas, were white with a tiny pink floral pattern. Though her cousins were pretty, Oi, with her light, flawless skin and large round eyes, had something special about her. A grace, a gentleness, and something else I couldn't put a name to, though I tried to. Late at night, unable to sleep, in my room under the monks' quarters. During the break halfway through the class, she asked if I wanted more tea, and at the end of the class, she brought oranges for all of us from the kitchen, while her cousins chattered. The other girls were no match for her. The classes came to an end as the exams approached. Chiang Mai Woi was going to return to Kampot. After the last class, I lingered for a few minutes in the doorway, holding the pay envelope in my hand. The family had treated me well. I wasn't in a hurry to go. In Phnom Penh, I had nobody to go to. At last, I pedaled off through the warm, quiet streets. A Honda 90 motorcycle passed me, pulling a trailer with a cargo of firewood, the noise of the sputtering engine gradually trailing off in the distance. There were few cars. I stopped by a roadside vendor, bought a piece of peeled sugarcane and sat down to chew it. From a nearby restaurant came the shouting of a high-pitched and unmistakable voice. It was the royal father Sihanouk giving a speech on the radio. He was a familiar presence. Several times a week he took the microphone off the government radio and talked about whatever was on his mind. Once he started, he went on excitedly for hours about the honor and the role of the country. Tonight the royal father was telling us about the dangers of the war in Vietnam. He said Cambodia mustn't get caught between the American imperialists and the Vietnamese communists. Cambodia must remain politically neutral, he said, an island of peace and prosperity. An island of peace. That's what he always called it. Cambodia was the envy of its neighbors, he went on, a highly advanced country. Famous throughout the world, we Cambodians were too intelligent to get involved in the Vietnam War. We were a superior race, better than the Vietnamese and the Thais. After all, he shouted, we were the descendants of the builders of the mighty Angkor Wat, the most beautiful monument in the ancient world. We were fortunate to live in such a marvelous country, one of the most enlightened and progressive countries in all Asia. All of a sudden, in the middle of his speech, the streetlights went out. The light bulbs inside houses and the strings of colored bulbs decorating the restaurants went out too, all at the same time. Another power failure. They happened all the time and we were used to them. Because of the unreliable power, most radios were battery run, and the radio station generated its own electrical supply. So the royal father's voice continued without a break. He went on shouting in the darkness, but I stopped paying attention. Soon the dim yellow glow of lanterns and candles appeared in the houses. A sputtering of motors gave way to a steady throb as the large restaurants started their private generators and their colored lights shone once again. If the royal father said Cambodia was an advanced country, I supposed he was right. If he said we were lucky to be Cambodian, he was undoubtedly right about that too. But tonight the issues of national pride seemed remote and unimportant. I hadn't said an extra word to Chiang Mai Hoi. She hadn't said an extra word to me. When she wore her hair up, it laid coiled over the nape of her neck. When she let her hair down, it fell thick and soft to her waist. We had been teacher and pupil. Very correct.